Have you ever considered that beyond this visible world are unseen forces acting behind the scene? This is part one of our Sacred Cow series, and we're going to start with an easy one and a short one, as it was in the days of Noah. So there we have a holy cow with his halo floating above his head. And the definition of holy cow is an idea, custom, or institution held to be above criticism. And it obviously comes from the Hindu respect for the cow as a holy animal. I'd like to extend it to also be something we are so used to hearing, we now consider it self-evident and hence never question. So it's something that we see as sacred and we don't question. The phrase "as it was in the days of Noah" comes up all over the internet, and we'll look at that in a moment. But it comes from these two main verses, one in Luke 17:26 and one in Matthew 24:37. And let's just look at the Luke one. It says, "Just as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man." And my question to you, as you hear the phrase "as it was in the days of Noah," what do you think that means? What comes to your mind? And we're going to have a look now at what the Bible actually says, and we can compare, or you can compare what you were thinking with what we see in the Bible. So let's have a look at the context of the scripture about the coming of the Son of Man and how it relates to the days of Noah. And we're going to look at the Matthew one, starting at Matthew 24:37. "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." So what we have is Jesus making that statement in verse 37, and then the next two verses, which straddle across two verses, but it's actually just the one sentence, explains why his statement is so. And we know that because it starts with the word "for." So this verse here is explained in the following two verses. And basically what it's saying, it'll be like the days of Noah, because in the days of Noah, this flood was coming, which would destroy all of mankind. But instead of preparing for it or being worried about it in any fashion, they were doing everyday things, eating, drinking, marrying, doing the sort of things that you do if you're going to be living for years to come, instead of preparing for disaster. So it's a perfect example he's chosen, because it compares another scenario where the whole world is moving towards a disaster, but making absolutely no preparation for it. Now, as far as I can tell, the guy that has popularized this phrase "in the days of Noah" more than anyone else is Chuck Missler. Obviously that phrase comes from the verse we just read, or verses. However, I didn't used to hear it a lot when I was much younger. And this man on the screen here, firstly I should just mention that the Bible software that I looked at just now, it's actually a website, Blue Letter Bible, is part of Chuck Missler's ministry. So those verses, when we read them, were from a web page created by a group that he works with. He's from Koinonia House, as you can see the little logo at the bottom right of the screen there. And a little while ago he brought out a series, it may have been video or CD, I'm not sure, called "The Return of the Nephilim," which connected to this verse more than is seen in the explicit reading of it. And what I'm going to show you now is not from that particular series, but it is him talking about it. And he puts it in a really good way, and he's very honest about what that connection is. So I'm just going to play that for you now.
But in the middle of this briefing, about verse 37 of Matthew 24, Jesus makes a very strange remark. He says, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now, in the context there, what he may have been alluding to is simply that it'll be business as usual until, just as it was business as usual until Noah and the ark, it'll be business as usual until he returns. And most people who read that passage assume that that's all he meant. It's just that it's going to come as a surprise. And yet, there are many scholars from the context of the details of that passage feel he was giving us a hint of something deeper. And we really won't understand what he's talking about unless we understand what the days of Noah were like.
So there we go. He's explaining what the link is to the Old Testament, in particular verses about the Nephilim, and he explains the strength of that link, or strength or weakness. I'm just going to replay that bit so that you hear it again.
And yet there are many scholars from the context of the details of that passage feel he was giving us a hint of something deeper.
So there we have it. Chuck is being very honest. I'm a big fan of his. And he phrases it like this: there are many scholars who, from the context of this passage, feel that Jesus is talking about or hinting at something deeper. So that's the strength of the connection. So everything that we build on from here is built on that link, which is admittedly a group of scholars, he says many, who feel that it is Jesus is hinting at something deeper. So as long as we make that link and we explicitly say what the link is and how strong or weak it is, as Chuck has just done, then I've got absolutely no problem. But what you find in many of the subsequent videos, and I don't mean subsequent by Chuck Missler himself, but by many others, that is not referred to at all. In fact, only that first verse is read, not the 4 and the explanation of the next 2 verses. And I've heard Chuck speak on this topic quite a bit. I've heard him say things like it's a hint and a wink to the Old Testament and to deeper things, which is also fine. But if we believe that this is an absolute link, instead of just something we're investigating, we think there could be more to it. If we believe this is an absolute link, we end up going down a road and believing something to be absolute, which is actually just a theory, and is admittedly a theory. But it can become a lot more than a theory if we do not understand that link. So there are many examples online I could show where the verses that begin with the 4 in Matthew that explain the statement as in the days of Noah are not even referenced at all. So what I find happening is that Chuck Missler has mentioned that there's this vague link to the Old Testament, but there's obviously an explicit explanation given in the New Testament about what in the Old Testament it's referring to. In other words, it's referring to the eating and drinking and marrying. But in the subsequent videos that people have been doing, and online articles, etc., many are completely leaving off the explicit explanation that is found in the text itself, and all we are left with is trying to find a link in the Old Testament. So what it sounds like is something along the lines of Jesus said it'll be like as it was in the days of Noah when he returns. So what was it like in the days of Noah? And the explanation that's explicit is not given. There's so many examples I could give. I'm just going to give this one because the guy that I don't know, and I won't even give his name because he, as I often say, he may do it correctly most of the time and then forget to add the reference in, but let's just see how he explains it. He's talking to Gary Stearman on Prophecy Watchers. Let's see how he phrases it.
Take place. And so basically Christ outlines this apocalyptic vision that we read about in the book of Revelation. But then he pauses and he says, it's going to be just as it was in the days of Noah. And of course, to that Jewish audience, to those Jewish males, they would have been very familiar with the story of Noah. They immediately would have remembered what had been told to them and read to them about Noah and the days of Noah. So in order to understand this, what Christ was doing there in his parallel that he was drawing between the days of Noah and the end times, we have to rewind back to the days of Noah and take a trip back in time and to examine in the book of Genesis exactly what the days of Noah were like. And that's when we begin to get into really the meat of what Christ was talking about.
So here's a simple search in YouTube, as it was in the days of Noah, is what I'm searching for. And you can see what's coming up here. End time prophecy, fallen angels, talking about the tribulation. There's the black-eyed kids are of interest at the moment, but again, fallen angels. So in other words, the phrase "as in the days of Noah" has become associated with watchers, fallen angels, Nephilim, this is Chuck Missler, etc. So it's, and some of it's hard to tell from the picture. In this case, it's talking about transhumanism and genetic manipulation, which again is related to the Nephilim, and the question is, when they come back, will they, or even when they came before, did they do genetic manipulation? So these are sorts of questions that come up. So just from that one little link, we now have this incredible range of things, all related to Nephilim, but different theories, such as here's a hybrid Nephilim, which kind of links in with the genetic manipulation. And you can see there's a whole internet, you could call it a craze, I suppose, on this topic. And the reason is, it is way more interesting looking at this in some ways than in the direct interpretation. This is pretty mysterious. I mean, you've got a human there mixed in with a Pegasus or whatever that is, and there is definitely an attraction to it, and I'll be the first to say that I enjoy it myself. At no point have I said that it's wrong, or definitely even that, haven't even said the link is wrong, but we should always state how strong the link is. But here's something that you get into a lot with these things, is giants. And this is a story, Genesis 6, that Steve Quayle and Tim Alberino, and you can see there's a giant there that they say has been captured in Afghanistan. There's a reason I just point that out as we went past and I saw it, and it's because of this here. It's because in Timothy we're told, not in Timothy, rather in, is it Timothy, or is this, it is Timothy, yep, it is in Timothy, 1 verse 3, as I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus, so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. So one issue is false doctrines, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. Such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. So one of the issues I see is this concept of myths. It can become an issue. In this case, this is a myth. It's soldiers that claim that they were part of a group that went and got this. It's always a red-haired giant with 6 fingers, 6 toes, and it's very hard to prove or disprove. It's just a theory. Sometimes it gets into more literal, what we'd call myths. A lot of these things can lead to looking at Babylonian myths and what was actually, which parts of the myths are actually have some truth in it. And I mean, what's interesting about this verse in Timothy here is that endless genealogies. I mean, genealogies appear in the Bible, and they do have some. There's interesting things we can see looking at genealogies. You see Bathsheba is in Jesus's ancestry, but if we get into it too far, we can find ourselves in trouble. And I basically have 2 things that I'd point to regarding this. And one is just the simple honesty that we need to always show what the link is. There are other links to the Old Testament. Here you have pictures of locusts in Revelation, and the link here is more direct in the sense that in Revelation, down there you see Revelation 9, it talks about Abaddon opening the pit and these locusts coming out, and Apollyon. And there's a lot in there, and the fact that it's in the Bible, I believe, means we should look at it. And really, what is the worst that could go wrong? You may think that these locusts are genetic hybrids. Maybe they're not. You may think they're Nephilim escaping out of the pit where they've been bound in darkness, and you may be wrong. It actually doesn't make a big difference, to be honest. It is worth spending some time in if you're interested in it. A lot of people, this is of no interest whatsoever, but I'm talking to those of you that are a bit like me, who enjoy this sort of thing. And where it can get an issue is 2 places. One is where we put too much effort into it, in terms of researching it and forget the tenuous links that sometimes are involved, and then you end up listening to myths, and it gets confusing. You get the Book of Enoch coming in, and it can lead to a whole area that is borderline, as long as we remember, again, the strength of the argument and weakness of it, we're okay, I would imagine. But there's something else, and it's basically, when we look at these things, and I think this is the warning that we're getting in Timothy, what that time that's taken up looking at this could be taken up doing other things. And this is definitely not the most important thing. And I think it's easy to find yourself getting sucked into this and not doing things that we're clearly told to do. So, for example, the verse that we looked at, or verses, it talks about how the world, and this was the explicit definition or explanation of as in the days of Noah, it's showing how the world was caught up doing the things that the world does. And we know in our day that we're called to speak to the world, and they're basically marching slowly off a cliff, and to bring the gospel. That is our first call, way before any of this stuff. And I'm well aware that sometimes these things that you see on the screen, there's conferences, etc., and it is a bit of an opening for the gospel, especially when they link it to UFOs, which is another road they go down. You get people coming in just interested in UFOs, and it can be an outreach. Other times it's just Christians debating. But can you imagine in Noah's Ark, when Noah was building the ark, and one day he said to his family, look, we need to have a discussion. I'm not too sure if when the flood comes it's going to be via water falling from heaven, rain, or I've heard it may be the fountains of the deep are going to unleash. And then they have a conference and they're discussing it, and you have this group discussing these details, which really are not of great importance. They're of interest, and it might be worth spending some time on it. Where it goes wrong is when you stop building the ark. So you're discussing where the water will come from, fountains of the deep, or rain, which you wouldn't know what rain is. You might just call it water from heaven, because there hadn't been rain at that point. So when you stop building the ark to get drilled in in detail into these issues, that's when they become a problem. And the ark is symbolic of Jesus. We know that. There's a family that's going to be saved. It's not just one small family as in Noah's case, but it's a family of believers. And on top of that, everyone's invited to that family, and our job is to get people onto that boat, figuratively speaking. So as long as we don't lose sight of that, we're okay. We're okay to look at those interesting things and see how they fit in. So that's our first holy cow that we've looked at. And the reason I've called this a holy cow is, again, because people totally forget that there is that tenuous link going back. And if you forget that, you believe it's an absolute, and you forget to even mention it when you talk about it, and you sort of built that foundation, you've assumed it's correct, and you're just drilling down into detail using that assumption up front, and you stop questioning it. And it's to that degree that I call this a holy cow. I believe I could speak to many people about this, and they've forgotten that the link at the beginning is actually quite weak. So I hope that's of interest to you. If the whole concept of Nephilims and UFOs, etc., are not of interest to you, this probably wouldn't affect you, but maybe there's other things that you could consider. Have we taken our eyes off the ball and sort of got caught up in silly details, myths, genealogies, whatever it might be, and forgotten the big picture?